Have you ever asked yourself where everything is coming from? Most probably you have, right? So it's a very profound and an important question to ask because it gives you the historical background, also the understanding of what is around us and what are those things and how they function, why they are this the way they are, right? So I think that's a very important thing, especially when we're going to talk about chemistry. As you know, that there are living things, also there are non-living things. So the living things and the non-living things, they have a basic unit. So the basic unit of living things is what we call cell. And then the basic unit of the non-living things, which is the matter, is what is atoms. So I won't be focusing more on the living things, rather we'll be looking at closer to the non-living things, right? So when you look at the non-living things, if the basic unit is an atom, so it means there's a build up there that give us the entirety. So when you look at the atoms, take them and put them together, they will form what we call a molecule. And then when you take the molecules, put them together, they will give what we call an element. So an example of an element, it could be hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. Those are examples of elements. And then when you take the elements, put them together, they will give us what we call a compound. So an example of a compound is water, the H2O, or the carbon dioxide. Those are examples of what? Of compounds. So remember that when you take the hydrogen and put it together with the oxygen, that is how you get what? The H2O, which is the water. So if you take then the compounds, put them together, they will give what we call the mixture. So a mixture is created by when you put compounds. A good example would be when you take water and put sugar, which is glucose. So when you take these two, because they are compounds, they will give what? A mixture. So that is the most basic fundamental. And then now let's look at closer each individual. Maybe let's start with the atom, the basic unit. What forms an atom? So there are these three things that you need to remember, which are fundamental, especially for atoms. So the atom is created by three things. It's created by what we call protons. The protons are the positive charges, which most of the time they are equivalent to the atomic number of an element, but that we will see it later. So the protons are the positive charges, and then also we have the neutrons. So the neutrons are neutral, as the word it implies, neutral. So neutrons, so it sounds the same, of which these are charges which they don't have a charge. This I meant they don't have charge, the neutrons. And then those, the protons and the neutrons, they are fixated, or they are fixed where? In the nucleus. That is why the protons and the neutrons, you can't affect them, they cannot be changed. That's why they are exactly as they are. Especially the proton, they're exactly the same as the atomic number. Why? Because they are locked where? In the nucleus. Whereas the electrons, they are round, right? So they outside the nucleus. So these electrons is what we call the negative charges. So the negative charges, we find them outside the nucleus, meaning these ones they can be moved around. You can lose them, you can gain them because they are not fixated and locked, right? So the electrons are what are the negative charges. So when something they are said is positively charged, this is what you need to remember. Why? Because if you have 18 protons, right, and then you have 18 electrons. So there is 18 protons, which means there is 18 positive charges. Also, there is 18 negative charges. So that will cancel each other because it's a plus and a minus. That thing would to be neutral, right? But if outside you lose the electron, make an example, if you lose two electrons, right? So it means inside you have 18 protons, which is the positive charges, and then outside you have no longer have the 18, now you have 16 negative charges. So if you look at the numbers now, you have more positives than the negatives. So if you have more positive than the negatives, we will say that it will be positively charged. Why? Because of the number of the electrons that are not the same. And then another scenario where you will have uh, let's say inside you have 18 protons, but outside now no longer having 18 electrons, rather you have 20 electrons. So the positive is 18, the negative is 20. So there is an imbalance there. That thing won't be neutral, rather it will be negatively charged. So the negatively charged and the positively charged, that's where it comes from, right? But I wanted us to understand the very basic, that the atom is formed by protons, positively charged, neutrons, neutral, there's no charges, and the electrons, right? So it means then if the atoms can form the element, we need to understand how does those elements are grouped, because they have been put in a periodic table. So it means we need to understand the electrons, how they are arranged. So they are arranged in shells, right? So it should be the nucleus, and then around the nucleus you will have shells. So the first shell in every element, it only contains two electrons or less. So it can't exceed the two. So it should be two or less, right? An example, if you look at hydrogen, hydrogen only have one electron, meaning in that first shell of electron, it will just only have one electron, right? And then when you look at like helium has two, so obviously it will only have two electrons where in the first shell, right? So but from the second going upwards, those shells they will be full with eight. So they are only full when they're having what, eight. And most of those elements were okay, maybe let's start with talk of the shells. The last shell in an element, the electrons that you find there, we call them the valence electrons. As you know that the electron, every element have electrons, but the arrangement, the last shell of the element, those electrons that you find there, we call them the valence electrons. So the valence electron is what is used to arrange what the elements in the periodic table. Make an example. An element with one valence electron, it means that element it will be on group 1. And then an element with two valence electron, it will be in group 2, with 3 group 3, with 4 group 4, with 5 group 5, until the group 8, right? But one thing that I want you to notice, something that only have one shell and it has two electrons in that shell, like helium, that will be arranged in group 8 because the two in the first shell is a stable, right? So that is why you will find it in group 8. And then any element with valence electron on the last shell with 8 electrons, it will be found in group 8. And those elements, they are called noble gases. Why they are called noble gases? Because they are stable, means they don't react or mix with something, so they don't lose and gain electrons. They don't need that. That is why they are called the noble gases. So how elements are grouped, you need to remember what the valence electrons. The valence electrons are the electrons that we find in the last shell of an element. So those electrons that we find in the last shell is what we call the valence electrons.